here with you. So I'm coming to you, and as are my co-chairs on the Zoom call, Alex and Nicola, and hope I haven't missed any co-chairs on the Zoom call, from Australia. And in Australia, it's common to do an acknowledgement of country before we start a presentation to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're joining you from. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm joining you from and lands on which I live and work, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging for their continued care of the land today. So a little bit of housekeeping. So obviously, you know, the session is being recorded. So we welcome and encourage active participation always, of course. So please jump in if you have a comment or a question. There are a set of common meeting notes that we've been circulating around the Zoom chat. I'm not sure how that works in the room, but I'll just share them again in the Zoom chat for anyone who's just joined. And I'm also going to share a link to the slides you're seeing now, because there are a number of hyperlinks in there that might be interesting. You might like to look up. So please add your details to the attendees list on the meeting notes. And if you want to tweet us, there's some tags and hashtags that you can get us at. And please do feel free to, if this is your first time joining the group, check out our previous activities, community meetings and other outputs on our RDA website. Okay, so just a brief overview of the interest group to date for any newcomers today. So the interest group, well, we met for the first time in November 2020 as a Birds of a Feather session at RDA 16. And we determined there was community interest for an interest group. So in 2021, our key activities involved forming our community and establishing ourselves as an endorsed interest group. So our charter was approved towards the end of 2021. So there's a link to our charter there on the slides. In 2022, we developed our interest group roadmap, and we focused our 2022 activities following this on developing a shared understanding of sensitive data terms. So the outcome of this work, we're going to talk a little bit about next, and we're also going to return to it in the working meeting component of the session today. In 2023, we're going to go back to our roadmap to plan our activities for the next 12 months. And so this is the goal of the majority of the working meeting happening at the end of the session. And throughout this time, so what is that now? Two and a bit years, we've also run regular community meetings, and we've had sessions at each plenary since our BOF. So feel free to jump onto our website and have a look at our previous community meetings and BOF sessions. So our schedule for today, linked at the top there, here we are in the introduction and context setting. We're about to launch into a presentation of the terms and vocabularies work from 2022. Then we're going to spend 30 minutes listening to some invited speakers, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion of this. And then finally, we'll give over the rest of the meeting to a working meeting, and Alex is going to take the reins for that part of the session. Okay, so let's launch into the presentation of terms and vocabularies work from 2022. All right. So as I said before, a significant piece of our work in 22 was understanding the different terms used when discussing sensitive data and creating a set of working definitions for these terms for the interest group. So what you're seeing here on your screen is our interest group roadmap, which we released in 22, and which included this activity, the defining terms for the interest group. So this has involved us collecting existing glossaries and vocabularies on sensitive data and crosswalking the definitions we found therein. Through this, we curated a glossary of terms for the interest group, and it's intended to be a living document, what I'm about to present to you. So it was necessarily carefully curated with a limited set of terms because we needed to make this a manageable exercise that the community could achieve. As other terms are identified as important for the community, for our interest group community, we can add these in. In addition, the definitions that we've curated will also eventually need to be updated. So our list of sources was also necessarily constrained so that, again, so we could make this a manageable exercise. And we know that definitions will change over time, and there are other definitions. So of course, we expect that we will be updating this glossary at regular intervals. So it's for this reason that we want to emphasize that the interest group glossary of terms is a living document, and we do expect that it will be updated. And perhaps one good trigger for this might be at the first plenary of the year each year to review these terms. Okay, so a little bit of an overview about what this output's going to look like. So we plan to share it in the form of a Google document. So we have 3 simple sections: a statement of audience and purpose, you see on the left, a description of the process we undertook to arrive at this glossary, which you're seeing on the right. And we've also recapped this process, actually, I should note, in previous community meetings and plenaries. I won't do it again now for time, but it is written out there, and it's also on recordings linked on our website. And then, of course, we have the glossary of terms, which we're expressing as a table. So we chose to present it as a table in a document because, well, we didn't have hundreds or thousands of terms, so it did seem like a manageable task. And because we thought it might be more easily accessible to a wider audience. However, you'll notice that the table is empty, and that's because we're actually working on crosswalking these terms at the moment in actually a spreadsheet. The co-chairs are working on this in a Google sheet. So we do have the information in that format. And if the community feels that it's better to share the glossary as a spreadsheet, then we are more than happy to do this. So based off the community feedback, we split the terms into 4 categories. So there's the core set of terms, so the terms that we include in our glossary, and these are the terms for which we have crosswalk definitions. We have terms that are related, but they're not in the glossary. So these are terms that we might hear a lot and might be about, in the sphere of sensitive data, but they're beyond the scope of the interest group glossary. So we've not provided a specific definition, but we have noted that they're related. We have terms considered but not included. So these are terms that we reviewed as part of our community process last year, but we didn't include them as they weren't specifically about sensitive data. But we have still included a record of these terms just so that we know that we did look at these terms when we were doing this work. And we have a 4th category there, which are just other related terms, so terms that might have come up through discussion or through extra reading, and we've just listed them there as well as being potentially useful in the future. So what's next for this work? The first thing that we need to do is the co-chairs need to circulate the Google document to the community. So we expect to do this over the next 2 weeks. We're just finalising some of that crosswalking to put it into that Google document. Then we'll call for feedback. So we'll leave that call open for 2 weeks. And we again do this asking the community to remember that this is going to be a living document and that it's never going to be perfect, but hopefully it will be useful. So we're going to ask for specific feedback around your thoughts on the terms we've included in the core glossary, whether you have feedback on the crosswalked definition. And we will also be including specific comments on areas we think are particularly in need of community feedback as well, to call your attention to those specific areas. We'll then potentially submit it to RDA for endorsement as an output, and this end-to-end, this process, is my understanding, can take about 9 weeks, though I am new to that process, so I welcome any advice from people who have more experience with that. And then throughout 2023, we'll be looking to promote adoption. And Alex is going to talk about this more later, so I'm not going to go into more detail. And then, of course, we'll set a review date for the work in 2024. So that wraps up the first part of the session, which is just an overview of those terms. You may have you may have questions, but perhaps if we hold them until the working section of the meeting, that will just give us plenty of time to jump into the invited presentations. So before I continue though, I'll just ask on Zoom and in the room, everything's working as expected. You can still see and hear. I can see Alex. Can you give me a thumbs up if that's all? Yeah, yep, nodding.
Yeah,
okay.
we can see and hear.
Excellent. So our amazing presenters today need no introduction. And you don't want to hear from me anyway, you want to hear from them. We've asked them to come today and present on anything they want really, but we did give some guiding dot points there. So we asked our presenters to speak about the level of sensitive data literacy in the community and the challenges in understanding sensitive data and sensitiveness. How often sensitive data is shared and just some of the cultural context around this, and of course the risks of sharing any data and how these are mitigated. So we're first going to hear from Steve, who's going to speak on behalf of the Social Science Research Data Interest Group. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Steve. I'm going to mute and stop sharing.
Actually, Crystal, could you put those
put that slide back up again, because say I'm going to use those as kind of the reference point, the three.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I don't have a presentation as such. I'm really just going to talk to the 3 points you kind of had there.
That sounds great. Thanks.
Yep. So thanks everyone. Just for those online, we actually have an extra full house. It's really quite impressive, the numbers we've got in the room here. I should say quickly, there are a couple of seats towards the front, and we do have a couple of extra spaces over there if folks are looking for a seat. No. Yep. So that's probably useful, avoiding feedback loops, I assume. Yep. Excellent. Okay. So so I think that the point we were looking towards today was really to sort of compare and contrast experiences within disciplines and domains, and so we've got the life sciences, the physical sciences, and the social sciences kind of brought here together to look at different sorts of dynamics. So I'm going to talk to the social sciences in particular, and for some of those who might have attended the social science interest group yesterday, there's a little bit of covering some of the ground I did cover yesterday, but not entirely. To really talk to sort of some of the themes that come through in the social sciences. So broadly here, we're covering sort of domains: sociology, political science, demography, economics, business and management. These are the sorts of domains we're really trying to engage with in the social sciences. So by way of introduction, I'm Steve McEachran. My day job is to run a social science data archive. So this tends to be my day job day in and day out, and I've actually got a couple of projects that are focused particularly on sort of understanding and building understanding of the sharing of sensitive data. So we're kind of reflecting on a little bit of what's there. But to give that some context, about 90% of the data that we share would probably be in the realms of what we might describe sensitive data, or that has some mediated access to the data itself for various reasons of sensitivity. Now, for the most part, what we're interested in there is usually around concerns over individual disclosure risk, privacy risk, confidentiality risks that come in there are really the driver of a lot of the concerns, and I say that's the result of collecting information from humans fundamentally. The social sciences, as it's in the name, really involves people. How do we ensure that we meet the obligations to the people that we're working with in the research that we're doing? So there's a strong understanding and a strong emphasis on the management of sensitive data and concerns over the potential risks to participants in the research. Some techniques that we use in the social sciences are particularly challenging for this. And we had a very active discussion about qualitative data, which is the collection of interviews, focus groups, recorded information, where often you've got a direct recording of someone's face, their name, a video or an audio display, which is directly identifiable. So the sort of experiences and challenges we have in the social sciences are often associated with the methods and techniques that we use. Some methods are less disclosive. In a lot of the quantitative social sciences, we're running a lot of statistical analyses. We're leveraging quite a lot of surveys, but heavy use of administrative data collections as well. That's probably the big area of activity that exists in growth area that exists in the social sciences, and has a bit of an overlap, in fact, with a lot, particularly things like population health and some of the health domains and health data management domains, which we'll kind of touch on a little bit later as well. But let's say, as a result of that, if we're talking about sort of awareness of sensitivity, say it's part and parcel of most of the analysis methods and the research methods that we use. Any sort of data collection you're doing, almost all the time you're going to be collecting information from humans in some way. And you're working through it, whether you call it an ethics committee or an institutional review board, some sort of ethics process, and it becomes part and parcel of that process itself. So the sensitivity is there, and that's actually leading into sort of the second question that we have. What are the barriers and enablers to sharing? One of the big barriers, and this is quite reasonable, but is that concern over sensitivity really drives a lot of the discussions and a lot of the concerns over can I even share the data that I've had, fundamentally. So working through the experiences of people in having worked to collect the data that they have, how do we actually embed practices in place that do allow that sharing to occur? Do you have sufficient protocol, sufficient consent requirements, etc., that come along with the processes that you've used for collecting data? And have you actually thought about that particularly early on in the piece? So, at what point have you considered the potential that you might be looking to share the data that you have? And have you embedded that in the consent processes that you've included in the work that in the process that you're using? So that tends to be actually one of the biggest barriers to sharing that actually exists, is the process and the concerns over the sensitivity of the data itself drive a lot of risk aversion. Would be probably the best, the best base, and that's perfectly legitimate. But it does certainly create a challenge for thinking about how you get the process of sharing data, and that holds also in some of the other collections that exist as well. Particularly, there is a heavy growth in the use of what we might term administrative collections. So that's data that's actually collected not for the purposes of research at all. It might be the case. It's usually the most prominent form of those is from government records, and being able to undertake and engage in the reuse of data that was actually collected for the purpose of management of administrative systems. Hence the name. Where then you have to go back and be thinking, okay, well, the actual purpose of of the collection of that data was nothing to do with research, and is there sort of the capacity? Are there the structures in place to even enable that to occur? And there's some very interesting things happening in different countries to manage that process. So there's been a heavy emphasis in the social sciences and then into related domains on looking at lowering the barriers to sharing, particularly of these administrative collections, but more broadly. A lot of the efforts to that have come out of the probably the best known of those is the 5 safes model that's come out of the United Kingdom. That was developed basically for sharing of data between the Office of National Statistics and the research community in the UK, and that model has now actually what would be the right word I'm thinking of, been picked up in a number of different countries, particularly the countries that Commonwealth, what might be termed the Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Have now picked up that model, and in fact, it's the 5 safes model. Okay, so Felix Ritchie and colleagues at what they were at the Office of National Statistics, they're now in the University of West of England and the UK Data Archive, working with them very closely on that process as well. So that model, as I say, now is progressively being picked up often in sensitive data management communities. There are groups in Germany, the UK, and I'm leading here into sort of successful sensitive data sharing models. There have been EU programs. There was the Data Without Boundaries program that existed from, I want to say, between 2013 and 18, give or take. That a number of the EU countries were involved in as well, and subsequent programs. In Australia, we've actually now had it embedded directly in federal legislation. As of last year, it's now been adopted as a national framework for the risk management of the sharing of sensitive data from government agencies in particular. And in some of we have a federal system, so both at our national level and state level, the regional level, there are different legislative frameworks that exist there. So, as I say, given the the heavy emphasis on the use of sensitive data, either from primary sources or from sharing for secondary sources, there has increasingly been a heavy emphasis on looking at models that allow us to manage the process of sharing those sensitive collections in a in an appropriate manner that mitigates the risks both to the individuals involved and the organisations that are responsible and have custodianship over those collections as well. So this, as I say, so that kind of leads me, and to the sort of the third area of activity, sort of looking at how do we manage the risks associated with that. We have developed certainly the frameworks. The 5 SAFEs talks about 5 areas which are actually really quite useful when you're talking about more generalized frameworks. So it talks about, are there safe projects, safe people, safe settings? For those of you who work with trusted or virtual research environments, how do you think about that sort of the settings under which the research might take place? Safe outputs, the products that are produced from the process of undertaking the research themselves safe. Usually we're interested here in particularly focusing on non-disclosive outputs. So what's the process you use for releasing outputs out of systems? Which is very interesting from the point of view of thinking about then researcher independence and moral rights and the like, which is actually the process of releasing outputs out of those systems undergoes a review before you're actually able to make it accessible. And so the model of research that often happens from these systems undergoes quite an unusual sort of review process and quite an intensive process in some cases. But again, it's really a means for trying to manage and mitigate the risks that are associated there. The last one that I haven't mentioned there, but the 5th of those safes is actually the idea of safe data. So you have people who are undertaking the research, and what institutions they're working with, what's the purpose of the research that they're doing, what's the environment in which they're working, what's the thing that's being produced at the end. And then you might think about as well the data that's actually being used. And the point being is you actually have a model for thinking about risk mitigation is a mix of those things. So how do you manage risk? It's essentially thinking about the combination of those in different ways. That does lead to different types of risk mitigation processes. So there are a number of, say, setting up of and the use of trusted research environments. And I'll point again to the UK here as a good example. This is kind of a crossover of the health and the social sciences, in fact, but there is Health Research UK, the Administrative Data ADR in the UK, and some of the social science trusted research environments working on a collaborative effort for looking at the management of the technical implementation of systems under the heading of DARE UK. I can never remember what DARE stands for, but there's a big program of thinking about managing and coordinating the requirements of setting. And I'm working on a similar project in Australia, as are some of our federal agencies. So we have systems for thinking about what's the physical and the technical infrastructure for management of those systems. And then there are things like some of the procedures you can use for managing the data itself. So that heavy emphasis on anonymization and data perturbation procedures, which have very interesting implications for the sorts of analyses and that you can undertake, or the sort of outputs you can produce. An example of that is the sort of procedures we use to manage risk might mean that you can't undertake the sort of analyses you need to do. One example is economics researchers are often need, or health researchers as well, things like exact day of birth or even time of birth. How do you understand the impacts of a particular policy? Say if your child was born on June 30th as opposed to July 1st. That's an important part of information that you need to understand certain policy outcomes as you see changes in regulation that result from particular days. Similarly, income distributions become important here, and often we might do is trim the ends of the distributions. Now that has impact for the sorts of analyses you can do. So as I say, that's why we have now the sort of the 5 SAFE model driving a lot of that work. Is it's a management of a combination of risks. Sometimes we can leverage up some risks in return for sort of putting tighter controls on others. So the higher the risk in the data itself, the more potentially disclosive the data, the more likely it is to be put into a trusted environment and very closely managed in terms of who and how you access the content itself. Now, as I say, these aren't exclusive to the social sciences, and some of them continue to evolve into related domains, and we'll probably hear a little bit about that. But I think the core message that certainly we're having out of the social sciences is most data is sensitive because we're working with say our object of study is humans. So how do we understand and manage the risks to those who are involved in the research that we have? How do we try and mitigate those risks in effective ways? And what have we still got to learn? And I think the sort of spaces, we're progressively, doing more and more around sort of the management of large scale numbers. The areas that continue to grow for us and that continue to be a challenge for us is what do we do about new forms of data or those that are much more disclosive? How do we deal with video? How do we deal with audio? Where, as I say, the next version of the GPT-4 will be able to take inputs, if we take images, take audio, they're already demonstrating this and potentially re-identify individuals from that. What do we do with those sorts of sources? It's going to continue to evolve as a challenge for us, and there's work to be done there. But because we spend, the ins and outs of a lot of the work that we do does orient it around, sensitive data content, we do spend a lot of time thinking about that. I'll leave it there.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Steve. Oh, sorry, my ephemeral voice blasted you away, I see. We have time for one question, perhaps, as Francoise prepares to give their presentation. Does anybody on Zoom or in the room have a burning question? I can't see the room, so feel free to manage that situation, Steve.
I think we're right in the room, but we do have a question quickly online, I saw flashed up.
Brilliant. I'm just zooming back through the chat. Was there a hand that flashed up, or is there a question in the chat?
I think there was a compliment. Yeah.
Sorry.
There are many compliments. Yep.
But there is a question now.
Could you read it out, please, Alex?
Sure. How do you consider combining social and life sciences data? Will this be discussed later?
Can I suggest we come back to that question, because we're going to have a presentation from our life science colleagues, and this is a pretty interesting area of activity that I'd like to hold a conversation until we hear from some of our other colleagues as well. So I definitely want to come back to that, but as I say, and it's very, very interesting to explore.
And an excellent segue, it's almost like we planted that question, we didn't, to our next presentation from Francoise, who's going to be speaking about the sensitiveness and non-sensitiveness, perhaps, of data in the field of physics, I believe. Over to you.
Yes, I have slides, but the slides were given in advance, so I hope they are somewhere. So you will have to update the program, because I will not speak about physics. I will speak. So this means I don't speak loud enough, Claudia. Okay. So. Yes, I am a bit worried if I don't have the slides, because I really provided them in advance. No, it's not mine.
Did you provide them to me, Francoise, or to someone else?
I sent them to the person who invited me, to the list of people who invited me. So maybe you can have a life science thing and someone deals with who is the next speaker.
That sounds like a good...
I think I've got the slides open.
Oh, brilliant. Would you be able to share screen, Alex? Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so
I will share my screen now.
Thank you. So the point is that it's not about physics, it's about astronomy. And astronomy and physics and the large physical experiments do not have the same practices in data sharing. So I will concentrate the talk on astronomy. I am François Genova. I come from the Strasbourg Astronomical Observatory, and they have a data center which has been there for 50 years now. So we have this long experience in sharing data in the discipline. Next slide, please. I'm not sure I can do anything myself. Thank you. So we have been sharing data for a very long time, and it's a deep science reason to do that. This is because it's at the core of a scientific approach of a discipline, but I think it's the same thing for many, many other disciplines, if not all. In our case, we discovered that very long ago, because we had to understand what happens in astronomical objects. We have to use different instruments. And now we also do multi-messenger astronomy. We use gravitational waves, for instance. So we have to combine data from different origins. We also have variability of objects on many different scales. And I think this is also very common. And we want also to compare models with observations, which is also, I hope, a common trend in science. So in our case, we have big instruments in space or on the ground, which are costly. And there is also a reason to share data, which is to optimize the science return. You can reuse data to do something else than the original goal. We are also used to international collaborations because we build instruments together. They are too costly to be built by a single country in general. And so we were able to discuss standards at the international level relatively early. And there is no commercial value, which helps also to define what sensitive means. So I really come from the other side of the spectrum. I am sorry, but the organizers thought it could be interesting to hear that also. So the next slide, please. The next slide is to explain, I think, the kind of data we share. So there is, of course, the observations we do with the big telescopes. There are large sky surveys which survey the sky homogeneously with instruments. We have added value databases, we have bibliographic data, we have modeling data. And what has to be understood is that most of the data is open. The observatory data is open, but the restriction in general is that, you know, to get people apply in competitive calls to get observation times on observatories. And in those cases, in general, there is a proprietary period on the data because we want to have the best proposals to build the best database of observations in the end to be shared, but to incentivize people to do the best observation proposals, they have the data for themselves for a given period after they obtain the observation time. The value-added databases are all open. They require lots of work, but they are open. And I should have written most of the journals are still the property of the community, which helps also to share bibliographic data. This concerns big and long-tail data because we also have the data we make public as well as possible. Data is fair and reused, are fair and reused. So it's because people can find, access, interoperate and reuse data. The next slide, please. So to be able to have fair data, this means that we have standards to share data. They are defined at the international by an organization which is called the International Virtual Observatory Alliance. And the aim of the IVOA, and it has been reached, is that data in astronomy is seen by the users as a single global and multiple data infrastructure. So you have fully seamless access to data, and the data access tools are also interoperable. The infrastructure is open, which means that anyone can share a data resource or develop a tool which will access the data. All the standards are public. So there is seamless access, and the users don't see the infrastructure, they just get the data they need. And again, we interoperate data and tools. The next slide, please. I think the next slide is just an overview, which means that we have a registry of resources, which has several instances which are harvested regularly. Data comes from many observatories and missions around the world and in space. There are many all sky surveys, and there are many things which can be accessed easily by the users. And we have tools which can put data together, compare data, and combine data. The next slide is probably the lessons learned. So I can tell you, because when I was a young astronomer, people got photographic plates and they took them home and they put them in their office. And in some cases, they looked at them. In other cases, they didn't. Now, after at least even either immediately or after some time, the data is open for everybody, which means that data is really reused by everybody. Looking at data on the web is really, for data on the web is really a normal way of doing science in astronomy now. So this means that for the users, it looks very easy because you know how to do, you can have your Python thing, you can use the web interfaces, you can do these things. But there is lots of work which is invisible from the users, which can be an issue by itself, but it's not the point here. So this means that to do this kind of data-based science, openness is really the key. And the message I want to pass is, I understand very well that there are cases in which there is really sensitive data, and we heard about it, and you have to manage risk. In our case, the risk was we don't have any more very good proposals because people feel it's not fair to them, not fair, F-A-R-R, but fair. To them that the data is to their competitors immediately. So the risk was that one. You have other risks to manage. But my message here is as open as possible and closed only if really necessary, which means that defining what sensitive is, I really think it's critical to open the doors to more science and science done differently and more efficiently, new possibilities to do science. That's my message, and thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you so much, Francoise, and apologies for mischaracterizing your talk. It was excellent. It was very thought-provoking. Similarly, we have a few minutes if anyone has a burning question before we move on to our final invited presentation.
Hello, I have asked this question by email, but I ask it for everybody. We can imagine that in astronomy, a very big event like a meteorite coming to the Earth can happen. That's a sensitive information.
I think
create panics and.
I think it's shared immediately because to my understanding, these things are shared.
Yes.
But I don't. It's not my field, so I don't know the details. But to my understanding, these things are shared. But,
so that means that in other discipline we care a lot about possible panics, but not in astronomy.
I think that it's an event which would be, if it to have a catastrophic event of that kind is something which is rare in geologic times, I would say. So I think that there are people who work at that. There are people who examine the bodies which run near the Earth. So this is something which is understood, and there are programs to deal with the risk. And again, it's not my specialty, but I think that when at least the programs which look at that probably share their data, because it's critical to examine the trajectory of a body. It requires observation for some time because they go rather fast and so on. So I guess it may be normal and useful to share data. But again, I am sorry, it's not my field and I cannot answer more precisely. And maybe I say something wrong about it because I don't know.
Okay, so my understanding of that is, in this case, and perhaps in other cases of sensitive data, it is more interesting to share data and less risked share data than to protect the data.
I have the impression that with the pandemics, we have been in the middle of that, that data sharing quickly and understanding which data was critical to share to minimize. There are risks which are not saying that you have to keep the data for you, but there are risks which say you have to share the data as well and as fast as possible. So for me, the pandemics was, please share data now so that we can do something, but maybe I don't understand. Again,
That's
I
really
am not a
interesting.
specialist. Sorry if it's wrong.
Thank you, Françoise.
Thank you so much. There is a question in the chat from Milan. I think if it's okay, we might save it for the discussion to follow, just so that we have enough time for our final set of speakers, if that's okay. And we'll revisit that question straight up when we get to the discussion section. So thank you again so much, Francois.
There is a question in the room. I guess it will be given later.
Is that okay if we, Steve or Raman, could you make note of the question in the room?
Yeah, we'll follow that up.
Okay. Fine.
Yep.
We have a dedicated time for Q&A.
Yes, we do have dedicated time for Q&A. That's right. Okay, so our third and final presentation before we get to the Q&A is on behalf of the Life Sciences Data Infrastructure Interest Group, and we're going to be hearing from Jeff and Susan, I believe, with contributions from Walmart asynchronously.
Hello. Thanks for the invite to come and speak to you. It's just going to be from me, Jeff Christensen, so another Australian you get to hear from today. For those of you who might have come to our session yesterday, our Life Science Data Infrastructures Interest Group, we have members from a lot of places, but our chairs are from these organisations which are shown here on the slide. So I'm from Australia. We have representation from Africa, H3A Bionet, Elixir, and the US. So pretty much all of these participating infrastructures are all involved in some way with the storage, processing, analysis, preservation, and sharing of omics data. And when I say omics data, I mean genomics and proteomics and metabolomics. So looking at biological entities or molecules within living specimens. I'm not going to really focus today on the environmental work, but that's also, a lot of that can be considered sensitive when we think about endangered species or invasive species. That level of that information which can be unearthed through genomic technologies can also be considered sensitive, but I'm going to focus on the genomics and proteomics and metabolomics work that is coming out of human omics sequencing. So, sure. So as far as the global landscape goes, things have really changed in the past decade, I would say. So we now have affordable DNA sequencing at scale, and the technology keeps on changing. That the cost just keeps on going down, and the feasibility to sequence many individuals becomes more and more possible. So currently, for instance, I can talk for examples in Australia. We've currently, it's been announced that every person under the age of 21 who has cancer is going to have their genome sequenced. And that's just one example of what's happening in the world. And I'm sure in many other countries there are similar programs at similar scale. So, it's been fantastic because, sequencing DNA from multiple individuals at scale has really led to a much enriched understanding of the cause of disease. Also helps in better diagnosis. That's really critical when people have rare diseases. They can go for 20, 30 years without actually being diagnosed with a disease. That, of course, they have the disease, but there's also a huge mental health burden with that. So, whoop, maybe I...
Jeff, can I take it? Oh, yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Sorry.
Cool. So I guess and also when we sequence people's genomes, it's more feasible to select the best treatment option for that individual. So there may be 5 drugs that are relevant to treat a particular disease, but depending on the genetic cause, we might know that 2 of those are much more going to be more appropriate than the other 3. So you don't want to start people on an inappropriate therapy, you want to start on the best for their situation. So really, in order to achieve these outcomes, you can't really analyze the genome of an individual in isolation. You often need to compare them to many other genomes of many other individuals who have similar or identical conditions. So, often in order to do that, the analysis has to be done across multiple jurisdictions. This is really the case with rare diseases. So again, for instance, I know of in Australia, if we're talking about childhood cancer, thankfully childhood cancer is pretty rare, but in order for, Australia has a fairly small population, 25 million. If it's a rare disease, there may only be 1 or 2 individuals in the country with that disease. And in order to do some kind of analysis, even to be able to diagnose the disease, the data needs to be compared against data from individuals elsewhere, so from much larger populations. And we're getting there. Really, genomic information is sensitive. So it's personal information, it's health information, it's considered to be sensitive. The privacy of individuals always has to be protected, and any data processing that's done has to be done ethically, securely, and safely. Okay, so that was the first aspect I wanted to talk about in the global landscape. The second aspect is really this thing about use of data for research versus in healthcare. And when we say research, this is where an individual has consented to their data being collected and used for a research project. Often the ethics associated with that project will be very specific. I think we're seeing a move towards future unspecified research, sometimes in ethics or consent. That's quite an interesting change. But I really wanted to just show this graph because, we currently, I guess, in the research sphere, we think a lot about research, genomes that are associated with research. But, over the next 10 years or so, the number of genomes that are going to be sequenced for clinical purposes is going to wildly outstrip the number that is produced for research purposes. Now, this is really useful information for analysis, but individuals haven't consented for that information to necessarily be used for research purposes. And I think there's a lot of work going on globally to sort of understand how we can harness, I guess, the information from those clinical genomics to inform research. Okay, so I'm just going to end my global landscape spiel on there are groups, global groups out there that are thinking long and hard about this. So the GA4GH, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, has been around for a number of years. It's, as its name implies, a global organization, and it's really developing policies and technical standards that are necessary to build a future where we can, imagine genomics at scale can be used better for research purposes. So on the right there is I guess a data life cycle. So it starts with the data donor, and all of these where you see a little circle is where the GA4GH has developed a standard or a policy that helps data essentially move around the circle. So I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but it starts with consents and moving towards more electronic machine actionable consent forms through to expediting the genome sequencing itself, through to expediting the work that research ethics committees do, that data custodians do, that data access committees do, and then also moving towards, secure APIs to do the analysis of the data. I'm happy to talk about that later with anyone if you're interested. Okay, so I was asked to talk, address 3 questions, and the first was the level of sensitive data literacy in the human-derived omics data research community. I found this was a really difficult question to comment on, and of course it's varied. So it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to a new PhD student, or you're talking to a seasoned professor, or we're talking about someone who's managing a large longitudinal clinical study, the levels of awareness of language around this is fairly different. But I would say and it's a bit of a cop-out, but generally I would say that life science researchers are aware of the concepts of sensitive data. They're aware of, you know, informed consent, ethics approvals, data access, and that data access needs to be approved by data access committees. They're very aware of the difference between data that's been collected for clinical or research purposes. They understand that, you know, appropriate authorization is needed. And generally, I would say they utilize the correct terminologies. But I would say that I think maybe some misconceptions or issues encountered, and again, these are my own personal observations from working in the space for a number of years. I think there's still a bit haziness about personal versus institution responsibilities under various legislative or other frameworks, and I think Steve mentioned it. There's a lot of risk aversion, and people are highly risk averse because they don't want something to go wrong. So often that's the sort of, oh, I don't know what to do, I won't do anything. I think a really interesting misconception or that we're encountering at the moment from the tech side of thing is that, you know, as we increasingly move to secure cloud-based platforms for analysis, there is, I would say, a general conception amongst researchers that that's somehow riskier than actually sending a copy of data to someone to store on their own IT systems. And I think that's really interesting because I will get onto it. It's all about trust. You know, how can I trust that cloud-based system? But how can you trust the person you're giving the data to, and how can you trust the institutional IT to keep it safe? How can you trust them to destroy the data when it's no longer needed? So it's a really interesting, you know, I would say time where you know, people need to get, you know, researchers need to get more comfortable with the concept of these cloud-based shared platforms. And there is a lot of effort going on internationally to develop these cloud-based platforms. If you're in our session yesterday, you heard about all the fantastic work they're doing at NIH to really pioneer those types of platforms. I think something that's really interesting, and I still scratch my head about all the time, is, you know, genomic data by its nature it's unique to an individual. If you sequence the data, in theory, you can identify an individual, but you do need to have access to, you know, siblings of that individual, or you know, some kind of someone who has some relationship to that individual. We've seen, you know, you've probably read in the news where people have accessed, you know, the public have accessed data through, have had themselves sequenced through ancestry.com, and then they've identified that they're actually related to someone else, or, you know, and other, you know, the police have actually used ancestry.com and those types of databases in order to identify suspects. So that's, I think, a really interesting topic. There's this whole private, I guess, set of data out there through 23andMe, all those types of things that I'm not really talking about today, but needs to be factored into the conversation. And I would say that, and again, this is my own personal opinion, but I think that sometimes the sensitive nature of human-derived genomic data is used as an excuse not to share data so people don't get scooped in a publication. Okay, so sensitive data sharing practices in life science community, barriers and enablers. Well, I would say a really great enabler is the work of groups like GA4GH and those standards and I was talking about. And also those standards, as they are standards, and infrastructure can be built that adopts or adheres to those standards. Secure infrastructure that observes those standards goes a long way to enabling this type of data to be shared and used in research. But again, I touched on it before, the barriers is for researchers, how do they trust the infrastructure? And, you know, I observe that there's a lot of, you know, people have heard of ISO 27K. So that's a standard for, you know, secure data storage, but, you know, it's not just the technical part of it, it's actually mostly around the social and making sure people are aware of their responsibilities when they're using that secure infrastructure. So I think a barrier there is really just tell me, is it ISO 27K, and I'll use it. And it's like, well, it might not be, but even if it is, you're only halfway there. You have to do a lot more, work to make sure that you're using that secure infrastructure in an appropriate way. And I think another barrier, it all comes down to trust. So if I don't personally know someone, how do I trust you? How do I trust you to run some infrastructure? How do I trust you to use the data appropriately? And there's still, there's many steps in this process to enable that trust, I guess, to grow, but it's still, I think, a barrier. And the last topic here is risks and mitigation strategies. So I think the risks, so data custodians, I would say, are extremely risk averse to sharing data through systems they don't personally manage. So you can see a themes coming up here. It doesn't matter how small the risk is, if it may possibly result in a breach, that's off the table often. And so there's a lot of enormous amount of time taken to build trust. And I would say that the risk for reputational damage is extreme to both data custodians and infrastructure operators if there is a breach, because that has breached the trust of whoever the research participants were who enrolled in that study in the first place. Mitigation. So, I mentioned multiple times that we're moving towards the building of highly trusted, secure frameworks. They really are needed globally in order to conduct research on a global scale in an appropriate way for these data. It's happening. Custodians really need to be reassured that these systems are robust and won't enable inadvertent data releases. We found in our case, we often require third parties to effectively vouch for how secure that platform is. So they do various security audits. I think mitigation, a lot of training is required. So training custodians in how the systems are working, but also training researchers in how to use those frameworks or infrastructures appropriately. And I think the training also comes down to enabling researchers to be confident that they're not going to accidentally cause a breach. So I think training is really key. And I think that's all I was going to say. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you to everybody who you presented. Very thought-provoking and lots of interesting connections coming across. So we might jump into some discussion now. We'll allocate 15 minutes to the discussion. So we'll aim to wrap the discussion up at 15 minutes past whatever hour it is for you. I, again, can't see the room. So Roman, Steve, if you want to jump in with that, I might start with a question from Zoom, just in chronological order. So this one was for Francoise from Milan, which was, what about older data sets which are not published according to IBOA standards? So I guess that's the sharing of those data sets. And Milan, feel free to jump in and add more context if you like. So sorry, we can't actually hear the room on the Zoom at the moment. Perhaps the mic isn't on.
No, maybe it's this one. I don't know. Do you hear me? Yes. So
Perfect.
most of at least most of the large observatories publish their data following the IVOA standards, and the standards were done on purpose to be just a layer on top on your data, which means you don't have to change the way you manage your data, but you have to provide data so that you can answer a question about which kind of data do you have and send the data when you are required to send it. And you have to publish just a line in the registry of resource saying you publish data in the view. So it's something which is not a big overhead on top of the work of the big data providers. So there are, I guess, some observatories which do not provide. I think that very often the data is probably available on the web, but I cannot say. But I know that the large observatories do that. SKA, which is the next horizon, the large horizon of astronomy, they are members as an international organization of the IVOA. So I think the actors understand that the data has to be published to be visible. And for the infrastructures, when their data is published that way, this means that it's reused more. And so it's very good for their statistics of impact. So it's a win-win situation for the infrastructure. What we do also is that there is data, which is data attached to publications. And in particular, in my data center in France, we deal with the data attached to publication, and we are in connection with the journals, and we publish the data with the VO standards also. So you can have your data, your table of objects, which was published in the paper. You see it as well as data from the Hubble Space Telescope when you look for data available in a given direction. So there is data which is in people's computer, of course, but the final data tend to be attached to publications, and in that case, we try to manage to make them public with the same standards. And the large data providers tend to put their data in the VO, so virtual observatory, so that they increase their impact. They have more users.
So the question I was about to ask earlier, I'm Heidi Laine from Finland, CSC. So apologies in advance if this is probably a silly question because my background is in social sciences. I just wanted to ask about astronomy data. Do you see any military use for astronomy data? Because thinking about the global security situation, which is kind of getting a little bit intense, is this a thing or a discussion in any way in the astronomy community?
I don't think so. I think that an obvious usage of astronomical data is to position satellites, because you have fixed objects and you use them to position satellites. But this is not a question of discussion because it has been used for a long time. So I don't think it's especially critical now because it's part of a game. And it's true that the data about star position is as precisely determined as possible by the astronomers, and then this information is public for everybody. This is true for the scientist and for any other user. And for the rest of it, Romain addressed the question about the danger coming from space, which is not the current situation by any way. And this, again, I am not a specialist, but I would tend to think that the projects who study these things may share data to be more efficient, because you need to be as efficient as possible in those critical cases. But again, I don't know.
Oh, hello, I'm Claudia from Brazil. And we have a bizarre case in which sensitive data may be fake. That's a real story about the past president's vaccination card, who declared it to be a national secret for 100 years. Now it seems this vaccination card is fake, which means that showing the data will cause some political changes because it's fake. And now the sensitiveness now has become whether it's fake or not. So I wonder if you have examples of sensitiveness in which it's not the data itself is sensitive, but whether some associated context would prevent it from being publicized or shared.
Possible example, but any colleagues? Yeah. I'm just trying to think of a related case. Say that there have been. So, I mean, one of the drivers that's come in psychology and actually in political science as well has actually been in falsification of data. Yeah. Okay. So the question, I mean, it's an interesting discussion about fitness for use and purpose yesterday, curiously, which is, and so this isn't an answer. It's how do you start to address the sort of queries that are coming up, which is for what purpose is that data being used, in fact. So as I colleagues at so the largest social science archives at University of Michigan, and certainly their experience was they actually the researcher had deposited into their archive a set of falsified data, and they were debating amongst themselves what to do with this known to be fake data that was published and inside the collection. There were similarly places elsewhere. So to me, there are circumstances where that's a legitimate use of the data, and I think this is going to continue to evolve somewhat, which is how do we start dealing with deepfakes? How do we start dealing with those sorts of potentially falsified or actually falsified content? Those become an object of study. Like so for sociologists studying disinformation processes and political scientists as well, you've got a quite clear case for that. You have to be able to articulate. That's the idea of that safe project kind of model, is how do you articulate those sorts of what those risks are and what so how do you get to the purpose fundamentally? And that's the point of a data access committee, is to understand and kind of look at the context in which the research is being undertaken, and then think that's part of that risk mitigation process, is that it's for this purpose, for this content is being used. So I can see a legitimate purpose that's there. You also have an overlay of a regulatory framework that then becomes a problem there as well. So
thank you.
I would like, so I'm Romain David from ERENA, European Research Infrastructure on Highly Pathogenic Agent. I would like first to respond to my neighbor question about the possibility for data to become sensitive after publication. And it is the case for some biodiversity data. Yes. For instance, when you have a species that is only showed at the department level, that is a very big area, but somebody wants to collect a species that is a protected species, but you know exactly on which kind of habitat it will be. You will find it. So that comes to my second remark on commentary about the possibility for data that is not non-sensitive to become sensitive. I think that it's the case for all data. If you have bad intention, you can build from very non-sensitive data something very harmful for lots of people. And on the opposite side, you have this intention to protect everything, because in case of, but what we do when we do that, we protect also metadata. So we are blocking all the discoverability of data. And that was very harmful during the pandemic with all data, and that provides the possibility to create false data. So that was the opposite. That was that arrived in India, for instance. There were lots of cases of studies that were showing that it's not dangerous, but it was. But because the data were not accessible, we couldn't verify the reality of on the veracity of the data. So that means that it should be forbidden for kinds of data to be protected. And the last thing I would like to say, it's very accurate in my job, is that when a data is private, it's a sensitive data. And 10 years later, it becomes publicly available by process, and it becomes non-sensitive data. So it depends of the view that you have. But if, for instance, for genomic information, we share that, I think in several years we will sharing everything. It will not be, again, sensitive data.
Thanks, Romain. We have some questions from the Zoom room. Can I jump in, Steve?
Yeah, I just wondered if colleagues in the room
Oh, yep, want to respond? Yeah.
One moment. I just wanted to take, is there any comment back on that one before we move on to the next question?
Related to the previous one.
Sure.
Okay. My name is Monica Marin. I come from Romania. I'm a sociologist, but I work in cross-disciplinary projects also. It's following the commentaries before. I think it's the case is with interviews with public officials in Romania, mayors. There are 3,000 mayors in Romania, but actually very few female mayors in Romania and fewer female mayors that did not get funds from state budget. So it's a combination of very population distribution of your key variables of study. It's very context dependent when you publish results about a specific topic, and it's also about the type of dependency relationships that your subjects have in relation to state authorities usually, in my case, because they are actually talking about the subjectiveness of public allocation of funds. So you need to take out, like in the case of rare diseases also, it's a question of size of the distribution of in your population. You need to take out some key variables in order for the data to be released. But I think it's still worthwhile to to provide this data, even though you don't have some key variables like gender. I took out, of course, locality. I took out NUTS 2. I only said NUTS 3, which is development region level, so that you can share, especially because these are useful insights from people actually involved in this process. So I think it's dependency relationships of your subjects is key to thinking about whether data are sensitive or not. Thank you.
I'll provide a quick reflection on that, which is, I think the model is not to say this is an either or thing. We tend to think in black and white, and there's this or that action, and that's sort of the basis of the how to get away from that thinking. Essentially, so I don't disagree that the identification of small subsamples, and Jeff gave the example of rare diseases being a good example, example of that. If you've got a small population, then the re-identification of people within that population is relatively straightforward. The question then becomes, and this is where a lot of the thing is, does that mean we don't do research on those populations? And by that I mean, because it's important. If we want to address, it might be that female mayors are, exhibit low. I don't know, low levels of corruption. We want to think about those rare diseases. So I think that the processes and the models that are kind of being developed is, okay, under what circumstance, under what context can we actually undertake safe research fundamentally? So it's not to say it can't be done, but okay, we don't need to shift the gears a bit, which is to say, okay, in this environment, in this trusted environment, then so that's where a lot of the models are kind of developing and converging, is to say, okay, it's not yes, no, it's under these circumstances, in this environment, with this, then this sort of work can be done. If you've got real identification risk, and that is the case with certain sorts of content, then you need to think, okay, I need to be higher level on the secure settings, or I have to be monitoring the outputs that are coming out there. I say, to get away from the risk aversion, which means no, it can't be happening, to under what circumstances can we manage the risk in an appropriate way? And I think that's kind of the emerging part. I'll make it. Yeah, so we get a question at the back. Oh, sorry, we have some questions online, I think, that we need to go
through. Can we jump in with just a couple of questions that have come through in the chat? So the first one here is, I think, from memory, for Jeff from Rita. So considering that genomic data can be re-identifiable, what do you do to mitigate the risk of de-identification, and I guess re-identification of de-identification, of re-identification of the subject? I'm absolutely doing a terrible job of this question. Sorry, Rita, feel free to jump in and save me. Is it a data sharing agreement? Is it tiered consent? Is it something else?
So I would say that in instances that I'm aware of, that the most identifying aspects of the data are not the genomic data, but it's the clinical and demographic information around the individual. So, you know, when someone is interested in finding some genomic data, they don't generally search by the sequence of the genome. They're actually more interested in I'm interested in a cohort that may be between age this and that and a certain, you know, demographic characteristic with some certain clinical features. Now, you know, people who manage databases, or for want of a better word, that holds that data are incredibly, you know, they do all the things that should be done to not, you know, have any personally identifying data. So they may, you know, instead of having birth dates, have birth years, or they may, you know, the standard ways, I guess, to sort of aggregate data into groupings that are deemed to be appropriate for, you know, not to identify individuals. As far as the, you know, the genomic sequence goes, you know, it always needs to be applied, you know, someone needs to apply to access that once they've found their cohort that they're interested in. So, you know, it's not freely available, it's always controlled access, and, you know, there has to be an agreement in place that, you know, the individual is going to use that in appropriate ways. So I think that's probably the answer to the question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeff. Did that, I think that answer your question, Rita? We have a couple more questions on. Brilliant. Thank you so much. We have a couple more questions on Zoom, and I think we have some questions in the room. We have time for one longer question or two shorter questions. How many questions in the room there, Steve? Can't quite hear you, but I'm going to assume you said
two in the room.
Two in the room. All right, excellent. So can we take one more question from the room and then one more from Zoom for equity's sake? So to the room first.
Thanks for that. Graham Smith at Springer Nature. My question is also for Jeff, so thanks for the mic. Yeah, I thought your presentation was really good because it touched on a lot of the same sort of challenges that we also experience. And I think in the area of genomics, researchers are typically very aware of things like consent, the procedures to go through, but there are these misconceptions in some areas around, for example, making data sharing, like making data available on request. That's just not safer than controlled access, for example. I just wonder whether you think the systems, the infrastructure has been stress tested. Is it because a lot of these principles are applied in a prospective way? Apply the principles, share the data, and that should work. Is there actually a level of stress testing to see, can these, like, is identifiable data, you know, is it being used to actually identify participants? I think one example is, for example, the Golden State Killer, I think, was identified from 23andMe data, which is good societal outcome, but technically a breach of their data.
Wow, that's a toughie. I would think that the whole point of things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and again, this is just my own personal opinions, are geared towards identifying you within a cohort. Where do you sit? What's your, you know, who are your relations? Who are your, you know, all of those things. I actually was once interested in using Ancestry.com to, you know, have a look at my genetic, you know, makeup from a population scale. And I read all the terms and conditions and I decided not to do it because I wasn't happy with the data terms use. And I'm sure, you know, the general public are not aware of that when they sign up to these things. I guess that's informed consent, but, you know, I'm not an average individual. So when I read those terms, I know what they mean. When an average person reads those terms, if they even read them, it's probably like on your phone, scroll, 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 yes. I think the data that's used in research for research it's on a whole other level of informed consent, you know, so there is a lot of, you know, individuals who explain, you know, in great detail what the individual is consenting to. Often the person though is, you know, maybe in just about to go into an operating theatre, so there's a whole other level of stress that's on top of that, which I'm not going to really talk about. But yeah, I think that I guess I can just say that there is large, especially in the US, I think we heard yesterday about the Genomic Data Commons, Genomics Cancer Commons. That's been there and in place for 10 years or something. That data, individuals, again, it's for research and have consented, but I'm not aware of any cases where those resources have been used to identify individuals. But yeah, I think the commercial systems and the research systems completely set up in a different philosophy and security way, I would say.
Can we get that last online question?
Yes, let's get this last one in. Last one in, and to end, I'm just going to go right back to the beginning because Yi Yang asked a question right at the very beginning that we said we'd revisit in this discussion section. I think it's a nice way to round it out. So just maybe briefly from each of the presenters today, the question was how do you consider combining social and life science data? And I'm going to expand that out into astronomy data, the principles there. So is there a crossover between the three areas that we've discussed today, or that you've discussed today? And what might these be? I guess just very briefly from each of the presenters, what are the synergies that you see among the talks?
I guess I haven't thought too much about that. I guess from the human genomics data, I'm guessing there's far more, relatedness to the social science data, and I think, behavioral information and all that sort of stuff could be linked to, genomic data or other various. I mean, if we're talking, it could be brain scan data and all that sort of stuff as well. So I'm guessing there are aspects that could be done. I'm not aware of any cases where that has been happening. I think it's most likely to occur through specific programs first, who would be collecting all of that data specifically, because, if we're interested in individuals, they need to have been examined, I guess, through the various methodologies. And, if they haven't, well, you can't really combine that data because individuals are individuals. So yeah, I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer, but that's my initial thoughts.
I've got some reflections, but can we turn to Francois first, just in terms of that broader question? No, I can come back.
My answer to that is that since I do not believe in astrology, I am not sure that there are crossover between sociology and astronomy. I have a feeling that there are studies of sociological aspects linked to health data. But again, I am not a specialist. You know better normally. So I'll let you answer the question.
Okay, so we just to reflect on that, there are certainly studies that are doing this, and that are actually being built directly to do this. Now, they've tended to be, we have like cohort studies and birth cohort studies where progressively they are basically taking at different points in the life cycle, more often birth cohort studies, where they'll work with new mothers, actually even prior to birth, and do different sampling activities, different healthcare assessments, but it is for the purposes of building a cohort. Now that has tended to be on the sort of for a sample level. And in this case, I'm talking about sort of a sample of a population, not the sampling process. There are now increasing efforts to do what's called genome-wide studies. Fundamentally, the one I'm most familiar with is in Victoria. Yeah, so there is a study of every child. The intent is to get every child, in a 2-year period, and literally work through and do
opt-in. It's opt-in.
Yes. And so this is the interesting part of those studies, which is, and there have been efforts in other places as well. 2 of them have failed in the UK and the US. There was $1 billion on the setup of a US study that never went ahead. Yes, with it exactly being an opt-in type of model. So the social science of gaining and engaging with the participants themselves actually results in certain certain processes leading to particular outcomes. So there's interesting challenges in the social process of collecting data that exists there, but certainly there are strong efforts there to be working with connected social and omics data of different sorts. But the methodologies that are involved there have to bring both of the social and the biological sciences together in that. More generally, I think this is just a point I just want to wrap on, which is you can though see certain things kind of converging between the groups more generally as well. So some of the work that Jeff was describing in the GA for GH is now appearing in the social sciences. We picked up in some of our work, the GEO, the ontologies work, some of the term researcher passports kind of has independently emerged in two different communities that are there as well. So the other parts that are there, I don't know if you picked up across the three groups that were here. Actually, what is driving a lot of the move towards increased data sharing is needs for global, and sort of global scale studies. How do you do that in the different sciences is quite interesting. So in astronomy, you're all looking upwards fundamentally and using certain instruments to do so. With the omics, we're having to do sharing at sample individual level. But in the social sciences, how do we compare certain social outcomes? We have to go around and ask people in every different country. So we've all ended up, but the science has driven actually that sharing process in those different domains to do the same things. So there is convergence actually starting to appear. The specifics of the sensitivity are different, but there are some common themes that you actually see emerging as well. And things like, being scooped, that sort of embargoes, those other sorts of sensitivity become part of the equation as well. And Jeff's point on the, I don't share, I pretend I don't share because I'm concerned about the risk to participants when I'm concerned about the risk to me, is actually, there's an incentive structure that's going on there that underpins some of these things as well. So, as I say, there are some common themes you can kind of see emerging there, but when we start thinking of different sorts of sensitivity as a result.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you to all of our presenters again. I'm going to, as is always the case with our plenary sessions, we put lots into our program and we never quite get to it all, but we are a fan of a community meeting. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now, who's going to wrap up and talk about perhaps what the work of our first community meeting might be, which might be the Miro board activity.
Yes, thanks, Crystal, and thanks again to all of our speakers. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly because I'm keeping my eye on the time. So we had a fairly ambitious activity planned for us to do together. Obviously, we're not going to do it today, but it would be really wonderful if perhaps if you had like a few minutes in coming days to have a go at filling it out. So can everyone see the Miro? Yep, perfect. So just a reminder here on the left, it's the 10 years of the RDA celebration this year. And the reason I mention that is because we are considering our activities for the coming year. These are the themes month by month, and we may wish to consider how to slot our work into this. But we had hoped to work on three things together in terms of our activities for 2023. The first one was about the promotion of our vocabulary work for adoption, which Crystal spoke about at the top. So we have some questions there, and if you had time to just pop down a sticky note and make some comments, that would be great. So there's a series of 4 questions. The second item that we'd love your feedback on is what body of work should we focus our efforts on this year. So in particular, items 2 and 3 from our roadmap, which was linked before. Again, several quick questions. And the final point that we wanted to ask you was, about our community meetings. So how often and what kind of content would you like? We ran our community meetings, I think mostly monthly last year, and we had a good attendance. So depending on what we would like to focus on in 2023, we may wish to sort of also base our activities and community meetings around that. So we warmly invite you to the next one. We'll send more information in due course, and perhaps our first community meeting can focus on some of these questions. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And sorry we didn't get to the Miro board activity, but we'll be in touch again. Please sign up to our interest group on the RDA website if you want to get notifications when we make posts about when our community meetings will be. If you have a specific interest and you want to be more involved, feel free to send any or all of the co-chairs an email, where we always welcome any level of participation, and newcomers are always welcome, of course. So sign up to the interest group, keep in touch, and we look forward to seeing you at the next community meeting.